Tiki Ghosn, a man who's been in the background of the MMA world for over 25 years, but just having seniority does not mean that his contributions have been meaningful or even positive. Ghosn is a cockroach. You can't get rid of him. He just reappears in a different form. Failed fighter, might as well start coaching. Shitty coach, better get managing. Never has a man failed upwards to this degree. It's bordering on absurd, but his ability to bounce back is probably due to his connections with Dana White. See, before he ran the UFC, Dana White was simply a low-level manager who stumbled upon some of the greatest talent of his era. Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. And Tiki was there too. Well, they went on to have Hall of Fame careers. Tiki went 0-4 in the UFC and had a couple fights afterwards before retiring. Dana White ended up being installed as UFC president on January 1st, 2001, but that was not the only thing that happened that day, as Tiki Torch opened up the Huntington Beach Ultimate Training Center, where he started coaching and soon thereafter managing his own group of fighters. Tiki effectively replaced Dana White as the UFC's #1 in-house manager. Just like how Dana was close with the old owners, Tiki was close with Dana, and he's stuck around ever since. This would be warranted if he was a good coach or a good manager, but the moves that he makes are so inconsistent and frankly incompetent that he could be picking favorites, but then his favorites are just always changing. TJ Dillashaw was fed to Aljamain Sterling despite the shoulder injury. Tiki knew, and he didn't stop TJ or anything of that nature. He had the power to make a judgment call, but as long as one of his fighters is benefiting, he's fine. Aljo got fucked over big time because he had just went through 5 hard rounds with Henry Cejudo after a pretty long camp as well, and then he has to make a 3-month turnaround. Very few UFC champions have made 3-month turnarounds, and even fewer have been forced to make 3-month turnarounds. Aljo is at the top of that list. The UFC announced the fight with Sean O'Malley before the contract was ever signed, and then when Hunter Campbell, Aljamain Sterling, and Tiki Ghosn are all in the room together, Tiki says nothing. He doesn't rally behind his fighter, the guy he's representing, right? The guy whose best interests are supposed to be top of mind. He's making 10 to 20% of Sterling's fight revenue, and he lets Hunter Campbell walk all over him. And this eventually leads to Aljamain losing the title, losing pay-per-view points, losing his legacy because he was forced into a fight that he wasn't ready for. Now, we have seen situations like this in the past with other managers. Ali Abdelaziz in particular has a nasty habit of caring about his fighters less when it suits the UFC. Abdelaziz is intertwined with the UFC, but he doesn't have any real concrete connections. Tiki Ghosn has been friends with Dana White since at least 1998. I'm almost positive that every once in a while, one of them will call in a favor. Whether that's not pushing for a fighter to get a better deal, or a more favorable fight, or on Tiki's end, maybe some preferential treatment here and there. In my opinion, the 2 biggest rank squatters in the featherweight division are Brian Ortega and Yair Rodriguez. You're not gonna like what I have to say about these 2. They're both managed by Tiki Bar. Brian Ortega's only win in the last 4 years was against Yair Rodriguez. He realistically shouldn't have got the title shot against Volk because he got walloped by Max, took 2 years off, and then had an okay win against TKZ. And beating Ortega via a fluky shoulder dislocation is the only reason Yair ever got an interim title shot. He beat Josh Emmett, cool, and then his only other win is Patricio Pitbull. But this guy was recently in serious consideration for another title shot against Volkanovski. Yair Rodriguez getting the Max Holloway fight when he returned didn't make a lot of sense then, it still doesn't make a lot of sense now. Because before he left, he was only ranked 9th or 10th, and he was kicked out of the UFC because he and Zabit were ducking each other, and then Yair was running away from USADA. He left them with no choice. I wonder if there's some sort of connection between Tiki's fighters and steroids. That's what you should be thinking right now. I just set up that point. Come on, keep up. Yair ran from USADA. Brian Ortega popped very early in his career. Chael Sonnen had enough testosterone for 8 or 9 men, and he also got suspended for another steroid cocktail at a different point in his career. Rampage Jackson was also connected to TRT and that whole deal. Paulo Costa was caught using IVs in 2019. Joey Beltran used anabolic steroids in 2012. TJ Dillashaw was under Tiki's management during his steroid debacle. Rico Rodriguez failed quite a few drug tests, and Antonio Tricoli popped in 2019. There's probably more, but this is the bulk of the list. These are the big names. So you very well could make some allegations about, steroid use and connections to the Tiki Hut. As previously mentioned, Ghosn's management company Arsenal Sports Agency currently represents both Rampage Jackson and Chael Sonnen. Now, I don't know if you read the news, but those two are having quite the day in the sun right now. Rampage for raising a fucking asshole, and Chael for defending him. Chael Sonnen has sort of been defending Raja Jackson, or shielding the blame, or deflecting. There's a bunch of words that you can use, and part of me wants to just say, stupid old man, you don't know anything, you're just doing this for views. But then there's another part of me, he's very mischievous, and he wants me to say that Rampage called in a favor to Tiki, who called in a favor to Chael, to use his million-plus subscriber audience to manage the blowback, or soften it, or what have you. I don't think it's impossible that they use Chael as a way to spread false information or cloud the narrative, because someone who's relatively well-liked in the community says so. A lot of people are going to listen to Chael. Maybe not on this specific situation, but there's been other times where Chael has maybe said something unpopular and he has convinced a certain subsection of fans. That's happened before. Now, this next bit might just be a coincidence, but the media has been really focused on the Raja Jackson story, and the best way to make it stop is to divert them. So just announced the day that I'm writing this, Tracy Cortez versus Erin Blanchfield, and heavily rumored Mackenzie Dern versus Verna Jandiroba. Cortez and Dern are both managed by Tiki, and both of these opportunities that they've been given seem kind of strange. Mackenzie Dern is getting a vacant title shot after beating Amanda Hebos, and Tracy Cortez is getting a massive jump up the rankings after beating unranked Vivian Araújo and losing to Rose Namajunas earlier this year. I think this is more of a case of preferential treatment, but trying to move media attention away from the Raja Jackson situation is probably a bit of a stretch, I understand that. But things like this often work out very well for Tiki Torch. The timing usually lines up for him. The most recent case of conflict of interest happened on UFC Shanghai. Aljamain Sterling versus Brian Ortega gets booked for 3 rounds, and then a couple weeks out, gets randomly upped to a 5-round co-main event. Aljo didn't want 5 rounds because then he would have to do more work for just as much pay. You don't get a main event bonus when you're a 5-round co-main, and I think that's completely fair. But when your manager is in charge of the decisions made by both you and your opponent, there are usually some issues. Then, Tiki almost let Brian Ortega die. He fell while weight cutting, he was sick, he hobbled to the weigh-in, and then they weekend at Bernie'd him, right down to the octagon, where he had an extremely lackluster performance, just fainting at range for 5 rounds, and this all could have been avoided because Brian obviously wasn't fit to compete. I think that the onus should partially fall on Tiki. You're there with this guy as his manager, his cornerman. You're in a foreign country, and you're the adult in the room. You're in charge of making maybe some tough decisions, and I think that Tiki should have looked out more for Brian's well-being. Ortega has wanted to move up to lightweight for years. There's been stories for years of, oh, Brian's finally moving up to lightweight, and then it just never materializes. That is also Tiki's responsibility to make that happen. But the UFC didn't want Ortega to move up, and here's the key, because they needed him to build a couple of contenders at featherweight. He's a big name. He can do a lot for guys like Diego Lopez or Yair Rodriguez. They blocked him from moving up, and he has taken physical damage, falling in the sauna, cutting weight that's not coming off. That all builds up after a while. That's probably going to negatively impact Brian in the future. And why was the fight still 5 rounds, even after Ortega collapsed? That's added fight time that he can take more damage in. Luckily, Aljo's not known for his punch power. And our final piece of evidence in our case against Tiki Ghosn relies very heavily on Sean Strickland's second-hand account, so mileage may vary. Strickland is usually an unreliable narrator, but a broken clock is right twice a day, and Strickland's upbringing gives him a really strange moral compass that also works for these kinds of scenarios. He despises homeless people, but he also hates domestic violence. So take everything with a pinch of salt, but also understand that Strickland has been right about these kinds of things in the past with regard to the potential grooming of Rose Namajunas and Aspen Ladd. When you pull on those threads and actually put research behind them, the crazy Twitter rambling turns into pretty legitimate criticism. Sean has good instincts for these kinds of things. Some could say that he has a sixth sense for domestic violence. So about a year ago, Sean goes on this crusade about Tiki Ghosn, claiming that he's groomed girls in the past, covered up sexual assaults done by him and members of his gym, and been a generally creepy guy. Out of respect for the victims and their families, he didn't bring up names or particulars, but he was in contact with them, and they said that they wanted to eventually press charges, but it kind of went nowhere. Now, if you go searching, you'll find people all over the place claiming that Tiki has done some pretty horrific things in the past. some with more details than others. And the sheer amount of allegations leads me to believe that even if only a fraction are real, even if only 5 or 10% are real, we're looking at a very depraved individual. Like $100 for a blowjob? I'd do it for 45. 6 months ago on a podcast with Rampage Jackson, Strickland's name is brought up, and Rampage says, yeah, he's just trying to slander Tiki, I know the story, and Sean got it all wrong. And then he doesn't elaborate. So in my humble opinion, I don't really want Rampage telling me what is and isn't sexual assault, but who am I to judge? Again, it never went anywhere, but Sean was willing to risk his standing with the UFC, as well as going through a defamation case, so he must have somewhat believed it. Something that also could help legitimize this case is the fact that many larger news sources didn't seem like they wanted to cover it. You'd think that would be counterintuitive, like Sean can kind of do anything at this point, and MMA Fighting, MMA Junkie, and MMA Mania would all write an article. It's big business, he says a lot of crazy things, he gets clicks. But as we've seen in similar situations with Ali Abdelaziz, many MMA managers will often bar interviews with their fighters if a media company covers them in a bad light. So with Tiki Bar, you're losing quite a few big names. And here we are over a year later and it's still only been covered by smaller outlets. A weird AI YouTube channel made a video about it, and ITP did a video as well, very shallowly in my opinion, but he made the video. So it probably would have just been swept under the rug or forgotten, but Rampage's big mouth got in the way because he confirmed that there were allegations. Before that, Sean had pretty much pulled them out of his ass. We don't have names or details or anything really, but Rampage made it all resurface. In a similar way to how Matt Mitrione defended Pat Barry by saying, hey man, they weren't dating before she was an adult because Rose came up to me in the gym and told me she was going to ask out Pat on a date for her 18th birthday. That was going to be her gift, a date with a 31-year-old man. But again, Rampage gropes and grinds on reporters like it's nobody's business, so should we really be listening to him? You don't threaten a defamation lawsuit, and then, when the guy continues to talk, give up. Oh, Sean Strickland is too powerful, this legal action will never work. Because if Tiki Torch went to court and the judge said that it wasn't defamation, then let's just say he would be back in court very soon. And having frequent flyer miles at the Orange County Courthouse is a bad look. MMA and conflict of interest go together like peanut butter and jelly, and Tiki goes and works at Smucker's headquarters. But instead of deciding between grape or raspberry, he decides how much brain damage Brian Ortega is going to accumulate. The more that you put MMA and the UFC in particular under the microscope, the more corruption you find. And everyone knows that things aren't as they seem, and MMA and combat sports in general have been shady for their whole existence. But it's important that we call things out and bring things to light, so at least we, as a fan base, are informed. If even half of the total accusations that we've gone through in this video are true, it's pretty bad. But I feel like we're up in 75-85% territory, okay? And lots of people have kind of been giving me flack about most videos just being negative recently, and my response to that is, once you pop, you just can't stop, okay? Once you begin to notice, you can't stop. Things start to snowball, right? It started a month ago with Fernand Lopez. He beat his wife, and he's not as great of a coach and a manager as he portrays himself to be. But at least Francis left that gym, and he went to Extreme Couture and had success, but not recently. Now Eric Nixick is falling off. But at least Eric Nixick coached Aljo a little bit and was a big part of his improvement. Whatever really happened to Aljo? Tiki Mask set him up to fail. Let me know what you think about Tiki Ghosn, every controversy, and every allegation in the comment section below. The next video in this series will probably be about Hans Molenkamp. He's friends with Tiki and has his own troubles that I could touch on, so subscribe for that. If you want to know about how we got here, there are videos on the screen right now that will enlighten you. Do it. Click on it. You know you want to. Like, comment, and subscribe for more MMA content. Shout out to Shauna, Proletarian Gothic, and Vanny for being vampiric enjoyers. Thank you all so much for watching. Never trust Tiki with hair dye, and have a good time.